Hey everybody, I'm Dan, and this video is the first in a series in which I'll be helping you to transition to ultralight backpacking. Now I want to make it really clear right from the start that my main goal isn't just to get you to carry the lightest possible pack weight. I'll be teaching about the techniques and gear involved in ultralight backpacking, but that really is just a means to the end. The ultimate goal is just to be able to have fun being out in the wilderness. Lightening your load can go a long way towards meeting that goal, but sometimes people get a little too fixated on getting rid of every possible bit of weight that they lose sight of the main goal, which is just to be able to enjoy being out in the wilderness. Now, I'm not some expert who's hiked one of those major through trails like the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail. Most of my trips are in the 3 to 4 day range, and probably once a year I go out and do a longer trip of around 80 to 100 miles, which means that my experience is probably closer to the type of hiking that you are likely to do. I've been backpacking for about 40 years now, most of which was done as a heavy hauler, which means carrying a pack of between 40 to 50 pounds and sometimes even more. Now, one time about 5 years ago, I was headed out on a major trip of about 6 days. For me, that's major. And I was going to be hiking along the Continental Divide Trail in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. But the first day out, as I was crossing this high altitude pass, I got hit by this sudden August snowstorm, which happens here in Montana. And the snow was flying in my face and the visibility was down to just a few feet. And the trail got really muddy and it was kind of concave like this. So every step that I took, I was slipping and sliding. By the time I got down to the other side of that pass, my ankles and knees were so sore that instead of doing that big mile trip that I had planned, I had to just lay up for a day resting, and then on the third day limp back out over that same pass, just feeling completely defeated. Now on the drive home from that trip, I, with great sadness, pretty much came to the conclusion that my backpacking days were probably behind me. Thankfully, I was lucky enough at that point to discover ultralight backpacking, and what I learned helped me to get back out there and do longer trips than I had ever done before. So that's why I decided to make this series of videos so that I could share with you what I learned during my transition to ultralight. I'll be explaining some basic concepts and walk you through the gear that I have tried and discarded and talk about why I ended up with the gear that I have now. And another aspect that I want to cover that I don't think gets talked about very much is the strategies of ultralight backpacking, because it's not really all just about the gear. Now there's a lot of great videos and books and websites that are out there already. I really encourage you to check them out. There are lots of things done by the experts that can teach you a lot about ultralight backpacking, and I certainly am very grateful to those people for the work that they did, because they taught me a lot too. But there's a problem that I've found with most of those folks, is that they tend to be a little extreme. Now my base pack weight, and I have to pause for a moment and explain that term. Base pack weight just means everything that's in your pack except consumables, so not counting food and water. My base pack weight tends to run about 14 to 15 pounds, which according to those experts means that I don't even qualify as an ultralight backpacker. I don't know exactly who it was who came up with this chart, but some places you can find a chart that says that if you are between 10 and 20 pounds, then you're a lightweight backpacker, which is why I decided to call these videos Ultralight Backpacking for Lightweights. But to be considered a true ultralight backpacker, you have to have a base pack weight of under 10 pounds. So you won't be hearing me bragging about my sub 5 pound base pack weight. Now, something that happens when people start shaving off the pounds and the ounces is they go a little too far and they end up sacrificing either comfort or safety. Now, I know how to get my base pack weight under 10 pounds, but I also know that I would be miserable out there because I'd be so uncomfortable. So in my mind, going too light is just as much of a problem as carrying too much extra weight. And there tends to be a yo-yo process in this transition where people take all the weight, all the excess items out of their pack, and it can be kind of a fun mental game to switch out the heavyweight items for lighter versions of everything. And then you go out and spend a few nights uncomfortable in the woods, and when you come back, then you decide to add back a few items, we'll call them luxury items, just to be able to have more pleasant time on the trail. Although I am passionate about ultralight backpacking, I'm not a fanatic. And that is why I hope that you can benefit from these videos, because I believe that my experience as just an average guy is probably going to be closer to what you will go through. And there's an old t-shirt I used to have that said, "Perhaps my sole purpose in life is to serve as a warning to others." Well, if you can learn from my mistakes, I'm okay with that. So let's get started with just a few basic overarching concepts. Number one, get a scale and weigh everything. Now, it doesn't have to be some fancy scale, just some kitchen scale is fine. But something that measures less than an ounce. And whatever you do, don't assume that you know the weights of things, and don't go with the manufacturer's stated weights. If you weigh everything yourself, you might be surprised to learn that some of the stuff that you assumed was light actually isn't that light. Just as an example of that, we'll take the ubiquitous Nalgene container. Now, this 1 liter Nalgene actually weighs 5 3/4 ounces. Maybe that doesn't sound too bad. However, this repurposed old Gatorade bottle actually only weighs 1 3/4 ounces. Now, this can actually be quite robust. I've used these for several years now and dropped them, and they've been through a lot, and I usually end up throwing it away at the end of the season just because it's dirty, not because it's failed. Now, the first time I came across this suggestion to switch out your Nalgenes for old Gatorade or Powerade or water bottles, I said, "No way, I'm not letting go of my Nalgenes," almost like I had a sentimental attachment to the Nalgenes. And that brings me to the second point, which is nothing is sacred. If you're someone who's already familiar with backpacking and you've done it for years, you probably have certain items that you've grown really attached to. And it can be hard to let go of stuff that you've carried for a long time, but ultimately it's just stuff. And in time, you'll get attached to the lightweight versions of things, and the old mess kit that your grandpa carried 70 years ago can go on the display shelf in a place of honor. Having said that, I do want to confess one of the silly things that I still carry. This is a Timex travel clock, and it's got the indigo night light, and when I hit this snooze button, the time lights up. It stays lit for a few seconds and then it gradually fades away. Since it's not a white light, it doesn't ruin my night vision, and it has a very reliable alarm for those days when I want to get up and hit the trail early. Now, it might sound like I'm making a logical argument for carrying this travel clock, but the truth is I have a watch that I carry, and I could reach over and switch on my headlamp and check the time in the middle of the night. I don't really need this travel clock. But there's always, for me, been something kind of homey about setting up camp and setting my clock beside my head where I know where it is and I can reach over in the middle of the night find that button and just check the time. Well, we'll call this a luxury item, but it's only 2 ounces and it makes me happy. So sometimes it's fine to make those choices so long as we're aware of the choices and willing to pay the price, which means carrying that 2 ounces for many, many miles. Now third, there's an old saying, if you mind the ounces, the pounds will take care of themselves. Back to this Nalgene example, the difference between the Nalgene and the Gatorade bottle is 4 ounces. And since I always carry 2 bottles, that's 8 ounces. So that's a half a pound that I can reduce from my pack weight just by that one simple little thing of switching out the water bottles. So you'll be amazed as you go through this at how little things can add up to significant weight reduction. Now, I'll be talking in a future video about what's called the Big Three, and we call them that because they're the heaviest items, and switching them out can make a significant difference in weight reduction. But really, it's mostly about paying attention to every ounce because they really do add up. Incidentally, a common misperception about ultralight gear is that it's super expensive. And certainly it's true that some of the absolute best and lightest stuff can be kind of pricey, but that's not always the case. Just as an example, this Nalgene bottle, when I checked this today, it's going for around $10. Now this is free, so it's not always expensive to switch out to lighter versions of things. In fact, sometimes it's cheaper. And there's a lot of people who have taken on the intellectual challenge to transition to ultralight for around $200. And you can find those, and I'll make some links for those sites that talk about the gear list that is all fairly inexpensive. And another thing is that a lot of the lightweight gear is made by cottage manufacturers, just small business owners working out of their garage, and personally I think you just get good karma points by going to the little guy and supporting those small cottage manufacturers, and in the end you get better gear because it's handmade. So the fourth point is we need to let go of just-in-case thinking. Now, a lot of the weight that I used to carry in my heavy pack really fell into that category of thinking about, well, it might come in handy if I get into a certain situation. A better way to pack is to consider what things you might need on this specific trip in this specific area at this time of year. And just go with that stuff that you think you're most likely to need. And then when you come back from the trip, unpack and lay everything out and notice what stuff you didn't actually touch in that whole time. That's probably the stuff you don't need. Now there's a few exceptions to this rule, namely emergency supplies, but for the most part a good rule is use it or lose it. If there's something you take out of your kit and then you find yourself later on out in the woods and wishing you had it, that's no problem. You can just make a note and bring it along next time. There's very few things that you can't survive without for a 2 or 3 day trip in the woods. And if there is something more significant that you're just not quite comfortable with, like trying out a new shelter, you can bring both of them with you and make use of the new lightweight version, but have the old one just for your sense of security. And then after you get used to the newer lightweight version in a trip or two, then you don't have to bring the old heavy one anymore. And that brings me to my last point, which is that it's important to distinguish between needs and wants. I actually think that this is a good lesson for life generally. But when you're packing up for a trip, it's good to ask yourself honestly, do I really need this item? My travel clock is clearly a want. I could get by without it. Water containers are a need. I do have to be able to store and carry water. But the Nalgene is a want because there is a lighter version that will meet the need and and weigh a lot less. So sometimes you might decide, yeah, it's a want, but I really, really want it, and that's fine as long as it's a conscious choice. Okay, so those are just some basic concepts to get you started, and I'd like to end this video with a couple of acronyms that you see quite often if you read backpacker forums. And the first is YMMV, which means your mileage may vary. There are hundreds of ways to backpack and hundreds of possible combinations of gear, which is one of the reasons why ultralight backpackers are so obsessed with making gear lists and looking at each other's gear lists, because we're always looking for alternative combinations of gear and other ways to lighten up. Now, I'll be talking about specific gear in this series, gear that I have tried and discarded, and that's really not, it's mainly about understanding the thought process behind the choices so that you can engage in your own process of selection. You might make very different choices because what works for me doesn't work for you, and that's perfectly fine. That's great as long as it's a conscious choice. Personalizing gear is part of the fun of hiking. Which brings me to the second acronym, which is HYOH, which means hike your own hike. There's no wrong way to do this as long as you're having fun. So just get out there and enjoy yourself in the wilderness. I hope you've learned something from this video about lightening up your pack and increasing the joy that you experience being out in the woods. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button so other people will see it. And if you want to learn more, you might want to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.